You didn't need it anyway. My father's voice crackled through the phone speaker, as if he hadn't just admitted to stealing the money I had spent years saving. His tone was light, casual, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience rather than the complete destruction of my plans. I stood frozen in my small Boston apartment, gripping my phone, trying to process what he had just said. My name is Claire Lawson, and at 25, I had worked tirelessly to get where I was, a final year medical student at one of the top universities in the country, just months away from securing my residency. That future had always been within reach, something I had carefully built through merit scholarships, part time jobs, and financial aid. But now, in a matter of seconds, it was slipping away. How much is left? I asked, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the tremor in my hands. Left? Hmm? My father, Richard Lawson, chuckled softly, as if I had asked a ridiculous question. There's none left, honey. I had some debts to clear up. But don't worry. You're smart. You'll figure something out. I could barely breathe. The weight of his words pressed against my chest. None left. My father had drained the account I had opened when I was 17, the account I had spent years carefully filling, deposit by deposit. When I left for college, I had trusted him. He had remained a co-signer, not because I thought he would need access to the money, but because he had insisted it was just in case of an emergency. This apparently had been the emergency. Not my education, not my future, but his financial mismanagement. I see, I said quietly. There was no point in screaming at him. He wouldn't care. That's my girl, he said, mistaking my calm for acceptance. Ah, always so practical, just like your old man. Anyway, I've got to run, meeting some friends for drinks. We'll talk soon, okay? Meeting friends for drinks. With my money. My future. I sank down onto the small couch in my apartment, my mind racing. 3 months. That's how long I had until the next tuition payment was due. 3 months to find a way to salvage my final year of medical school after my father had robbed me of the money that was supposed to carry me through. The betrayal stung, but more than that, it filled me with an anger that burned white hot. He had stolen from me, dismissed my hard work as nothing more than a resource for his failures, and expected me to just figure something out. My phone buzzed again, this time a text. Don't mention this to your mother or your grandmother, no need to worry them. Of course. He didn't want them to know, just like he hadn't wanted them to know about the gambling, the failed business ventures, or the countless lies he had spun over the years. I took a deep breath, staring at the message for a long moment. Then I opened my laptop. If my father thought I would simply let this go, he had underestimated me. This wasn't over. Not even close. Claire sat motionless, staring at the glowing screen of her laptop, her father's words still ringing in her ears. You'll figure something out. The casual dismissal, the audacity of his theft, the sheer entitlement. It all churned inside her, simmering beneath the surface like a storm waiting to break. Her fingers trembled as she pulled up her online banking portal, already knowing what she would find, but needing to see the devastation for herself. The account balance, $0. Just weeks ago, there had been over $68,000. Money she had earned through summer jobs, merit-based scholarships, and careful budgeting, and now it was gone. Not a cent left. She clicked through the transaction history, bile rising in her throat as she saw withdrawal after withdrawal. Each one was small enough to avoid immediate suspicion, but together they painted a clear picture of calculated deceit. Her father hadn't just stolen from her. He had systematically emptied the account over the past 3 months, chipping away at her future bit by bit. Claire clenched her jaw, her breathing shallow. He'd been waiting until she was too far away, too occupied with exams, too focused on finishing medical school to notice. And now he was acting as if this was no big deal, as if she should just accept it and move on. You should take a break from school, he had texted right after their call. Maybe this is a sign. I know some guys who could get you a modeling job. Better money than that degree. Claire stared at the message in disbelief. A sign? Was he serious? He had stolen her future and was now telling her to abandon it entirely? And for what? So she could become another one of his quick money schemes? The anger inside her solidified into something sharper. No, absolutely not. She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus. Panicking wouldn't fix this. Her father had always underestimated her, treated her like a resource to be exploited, a safety net for his poor decisions. But what he didn't realize was that Claire had spent her entire life planning, organizing, and preparing. If he thought she would roll over and let this go, he was sorely mistaken. Opening a blank document, she started typing a list. First step, documentation. Bank statements, transaction records, proof of deposits. She needed to track every dollar he had taken. Next, research, legal options, financial aid, potential emergency grants. Then, cut him off. Transfer any remaining savings to a new account at a different bank, one he had no access to. Her roommate Sarah walked in, her eyes widening as she took in the scattered bank statements and Claire's pale, determined expression. Claire, what's wrong? Claire inhaled sharply before answering. My father stole my college fund. Sarah's face darkened. That bastard. Claire nodded. Yes, but he wasn't going to get away with it. Claire knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. She had spent the entire night combing through her financial records, piecing together the full extent of her father's betrayal. But now she needed reinforcements. People who wouldn't just listen, but would help her take action. The first person she told was her best friend and roommate, Sarah, who nearly dropped her coffee cup when she heard the news. He drained your entire account? Claire, this isn't just irresponsible, it's theft. Claire exhaled, rubbing her temples. Legally, he had access. He was a co-signer, but he knew exactly what he was doing. He waited until I was too busy with school to notice. Sarah folded her arms. You have to tell your family, your mom, your grandmother. Someone has to hold him accountable. The idea made Claire hesitate. Her mother, Diane, had spent years trapped in a cycle of excuses and justifications for Richard's behavior. Every time he made a mess, she had been the one left cleaning it up, and her grandmother, Evelyn, a retired judge, had always been the only person Richard feared, probably because she was the only one who had ever truly held him accountable. Claire wasn't sure if she was ready to unleash that storm, but she also knew she couldn't handle this alone. So she made the call. Her grandmother's reaction was instant. He did what? Evelyn's sharp voice rang through the phone. That man has been a leech his whole life, but stealing from his own daughter? This is a new low. Within hours, Claire found herself on a video call with her grandmother, her mother, and her aunt, Victoria, a financial consultant who had spent years cleaning up other people's financial disasters. When Claire finished explaining, the silence on the other end was deafening. Her mother was the first to speak. I had no idea, she whispered, hands shaking. He told me you were taking a break from school. Her aunt, however, was furious. This is fraud. I don't care if he had access. There are ways to make him pay for this. Claire looked at them all, feeling something she hadn't felt in the last 24 hours. Hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. Claire had spent the past few days gathering every piece of evidence, every bank statement, and every incriminating text message her father had sent. Now she was ready. When her phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, she took a deep breath and answered. Hey, Princess. Richard's voice was smooth, the same tone he always used when he wanted something. Got a minute? Claire kept her voice neutral. What do you need, Dad? Oh, nothing much, just checking in, making sure you're not stressing too much about that money stuff. Look, I was thinking maybe this is a sign for you to take a step back. You've been working too hard. Maybe a break would be good for you. Claire's grip on her phone tightened. He was doing it again, twisting the situation, acting like this was all for her benefit, as if he hadn't robbed her of her future, as if this wasn't completely his fault. A break? she said, her voice like steel. You mean like the one you took when you drained my account? There was a pause, a calculated one. Then he let out a forced chuckle. Come on, Claire, it's not like that. It's just money. You're smart. You'll figure something out. Her stomach churned with anger, but she kept herself calm. Oh, I already have. I've spoken with a lawyer. Aunt Victoria is drafting a formal demand letter. If you don't start paying back what you stole, there will be legal consequences. That got his attention. His voice sharpened. Legal consequences from my own daughter? Claire, ugh, don't be ridiculous. Family doesn't do that to each other. Funny, she shot back, because I don't think family steals from each other either. The silence that followed stretched long enough that she could hear her own heartbeat. Then, finally, Richard sighed. Look, let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. You know I love you. This is just a misunderstanding. She laughed bitterly. No, Dad, this was a choice. And now you get to live with the consequences. Before he could say another word, she ended the call. Moments later, another text came through. You're overreacting. Don't make me the bad guy here. Claire exhaled, staring at the message. He still thought he could manipulate her. Too bad for him. She wasn't his pawn anymore. Claire knew her father wouldn't give in easily, so she had to be strategic. The next morning, she met with her Aunt Victoria at her office, where stacks of legal documents covered the desk. Victoria, a seasoned financial consultant, had already started drafting a formal demand letter, outlining the money Richard had stolen and his legal obligation to repay it. He may have been a co-signer, but this wasn't an agreement, it was theft, Victoria explained, scanning through Claire's collected evidence. We can argue financial misrepresentation and coercion. He didn't just take the money, he deceived you into trusting that it was safe. Claire nodded, feeling the first real sense of control since this nightmare began. She knew her father. He thrived on manipulation, turning situations in his favor. But this wasn't just another lie he could talk his way out of. This time, there were receipts. There were texts, bank statements, and now legal pressure. Victoria tapped her pen against the table. We'll start with the demand letter. If he ignores it, we escalate. We can go for a civil suit or even put pressure on his creditor records. He won't like that. Claire took a deep breath. Do you really think he'll pay? Victoria smirked. He'll fight at first, but once he realizes we're not bluffing, he'll fold. Guys like him always do. While Victoria handled the legal side, Claire took another crucial step. She met with her university's financial aid office. Explaining her situation wasn't easy, but the response was unexpectedly supportive. The financial advisor offered her a mix of emergency grants and adjusted payment plans, ensuring she wouldn't have to drop out. It wasn't ideal, but it was enough to keep her afloat. By the end of the day, the first shot had been fired, a certified letter delivered to Richard's house outlining his options: repay or face legal action. Claire didn't expect him to respond immediately, but she knew he had seen it when her phone buzzed. Richard, what the hell is this? A lawsuit against your own father. I raised you better than this. Claire stared at the message, then forwarded it to Victoria without responding. Let him feel the pressure. He had spent years taking from her, believing she would never fight back. This time, he was wrong. The fallout came faster than Claire expected. The moment Richard received the legal demand letter, the cracks in the family's carefully maintained facade split wide open. At first, he tried to brush it off, sending Claire dismissive texts. You're blowing this out of proportion. Family doesn't sue family. But when he realized she wasn't backing down, his messages turned more desperate, then angry. You're trying to ruin me after everything I've done for you. But Claire wasn't the only one he had lied to. Her mother, Diane, had spent years trapped in Richard's web of financial deception, always believing his promises that things would get better. When she learned the full extent of his betrayal, that he had drained Claire's account, lied about her taking a break from school, and actively tried to sabotage her future, something inside her snapped. I should have left him years ago, Diane whispered during a late-night call. And this time, she meant it. The very next morning, she filed for divorce, citing financial infidelity and fraud. Claire sat in silence as she read the email from her mother's attorney. The document listed hidden accounts, unpaid debts, and even loans Richard had secretly taken out in Diane's name. He hadn't just stolen from Claire, he had been living off deception for years. Then came the extended family. Her grandmother, Evelyn, furious beyond words, called a family meeting without Richard present. One by one, relatives started sharing their own stories. An uncle who had loaned Richard money, never to see it again. A cousin whose college fund had mysteriously disappeared. A great aunt who had been tricked into co-signing a loan. Richard hadn't just betrayed Claire, he had spent years using everyone. He's always counted on us forgiving him, Aunt Victoria muttered. Time to show him that loyalty goes both ways. Richard showed up at Evelyn's house later that evening, demanding to see Claire. But this time, the door stayed closed. How dare you? Evelyn's voice was sharp as steel. You stole from your own daughter. Have you no shame? Claire watched from the window as Richard's face contorted in disbelief. For the first time in his life, his lies weren't working. The family was done protecting him. The first small victory came when Richard, backed into a corner with no one left to manipulate, reluctantly agreed to a repayment plan. Under pressure from Aunt Victoria's legal team and the looming threat of a lawsuit, he had no choice. Every month, a portion of his paycheck would now be sent directly into an account Claire controlled, one she had set up at a completely different bank, far from his reach. It wasn't just about the money, it was about making him face the consequences of his actions. The second victory came from her university. With the support of the financial aid office, Claire secured a combination of emergency grants and a modified tuition plan that allowed her to continue her studies without disruption. Even better, her professors, once they learned of her situation, offered her flexibility on assignments and exams, ensuring she wouldn't fall behind. And then there was the biggest victory of all, her mother, finally breaking free. The divorce papers had been filed and served, and for the first time in decades, Diane was starting to see just how much Richard had manipulated her. She wasn't just his wife, she had been one of his many financial safety nets. Now, she was reclaiming her independence, just like Claire. One evening, Claire sat with her grandmother, sipping tea in the cozy warmth of Evelyn's home. I can't believe how much has changed in just a few weeks, Claire admitted, still absorbing the shift in her life. Evelyn smiled knowingly. You always saw the best in him, but now you see the truth. And the truth sets you free. Claire nodded. Her father had spent years underestimating her, treating her as if she were just another resource he could drain dry. But she had proven him wrong. She wasn't his pawn. She was his reckoning, and for the first time in a long time, the future was entirely her own. Claire had expected her father to disappear after being legally forced into repayment, but Richard Lawson wasn't the type to accept defeat quietly. On the day of her medical school graduation, he showed up uninvited, dressed in a crisp suit as if he were the proud, supportive father he had never been. As soon as she stepped out of the auditorium, he was there, smiling for the cameras, shaking hands with people he didn't know, positioning himself like he had played a role in her success. That's my girl, he said loudly, ensuring that those around them heard. She gets her drive from me. Claire clenched her fists. The audacity of him to stand there, taking credit for her achievements, after actively trying to sabotage her future. Before he could say another word, Aunt Victoria stepped in, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. You need to leave, Richard. Now. His mask slipped. She's my daughter. I have every right to be here. Claire finally spoke. No, you don't. Her voice was calm but firm. You lost that right when you stole from me. When you tried to take away everything I worked for. You don't get to stand here and act like you had anything to do with this. The people around them were watching now. Whispers passed through the crowd. Richard's face paled as he realized that his charm, his carefully crafted persona, wasn't working anymore. Claire, be reasonable, he tried again. Family is more important than money. She shook her head. No, Dad, trust is more important than money. And you lost mine a long time ago. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there exposed for who he really was. That was the last time she ever saw him. As she joined her mother, grandmother, and the family that had truly supported her, she felt something she hadn't in years: freedom. Her father's biggest mistake wasn't stealing from her, it was underestimating her. A year after her graduation, Claire sat in her new office at one of Boston's top hospitals, staring at the framed degree on the wall. It had taken everything: sleepless nights, legal battles, heartbreak, and resilience to get here. But she had made it. Every time she looked at that degree, she didn't just see her education, she saw her victory. Her father had continued making the court mandated repayments, though not without resistance. His text had shifted from anger to self pity, filled with phrases like, "I'm still your father," and "When will you let this go?" But Claire didn't reply anymore. There was nothing left to say. He had already lost his control over her, his ability to manipulate her, his place in her life. Her mother, Diane, had finalized the divorce, rebuilding her life in a way Claire never thought possible. No longer shackled by Richard's financial irresponsibility, she had started traveling, reconnecting with old friends, and even considering going back to school. For the first time, Claire saw her mother as more than just a survivor. She was thriving. One evening, her grandmother Evelyn called, her voice warm with pride. "I always knew you had this strength in you, but now the whole world knows it too." Claire smiled, thinking back to the night it had all unraveled. The moment she realized her father had stolen her future and expected her to quietly accept it. He had believed she was helpless, naive, dependent on him, but he had been wrong. His biggest mistake wasn't just stealing from her, it was underestimating her. She had fought back, piece by piece, reclaiming her power and securing a future on her own terms. And the best part? He had no part in it. As she glanced out her office window at the Boston skyline, Claire realized something else. Her success was the only response he would ever get from her. She had won, not just the battle for her money, but the war for her freedom, her self-respect, and her future. And that was something no one could ever take away from her again. Claire's journey teaches us that trust, once broken, is not easily restored, and sometimes the people who should protect us are the ones who betray us the most. Her father saw her as a resource rather than a daughter, believing he could manipulate and exploit her without consequences. But Claire's greatest strength was not just her intelligence, it was her resilience. One of the most powerful lessons from her story is that boundaries are necessary even with family. Just because someone is related to you doesn't mean they are entitled to your success. Claire learned to prioritize her well-being over toxic loyalty, refusing to let guilt or manipulation dictate her future. Her story also highlights the importance of financial independence and awareness. She had trusted her father with access to her savings, believing he would respect her hard work. His betrayal forced her to take control of her finances, reinforcing that blind trust, especially when it comes to money, can be dangerous. Ultimately, Claire's biggest victory wasn't just reclaiming her stolen funds, it was breaking free from her father's control. Her success became her ultimate response, proving that strength isn't just about fighting back, it's about refusing to be defined by those who tried to break you.